A special report on new trucks and SUVs stolen from a factory in Michigan that wound up here in the valley on dealership lots.
Yeah, so we are about to show you how this happened, how these vehicles ended up here, and how some of our dealerships here were duped into buying them and then reselling them.
Tonight, Arizona's family investigates vehicles swiped off factory lots in Michigan, and some of those vehicles ended up here in Arizona.
Investigative reporter Morgan Lowe shows us just how this was pulled off and how local dealers were duped in the process.
Police chasing a stolen Ford pickup truck in Dearborn, Michigan.
West Chicago, crossing Terry Street.
But this truck wasn't taken from a driveway. It was stolen from the factory lot. We track more than a dozen brand new stolen trucks from Michigan to South Phoenix. Do we know what happened there?
So I think we're still looking into that part of it.
The vehicles were sold to unsuspecting buyers, now out hundreds of thousands of dollars. How did the state of Arizona miss this?
That's a great question.
And we're about to confront the accused ringleader. I think we'll go bang on the door.
We sell everything from late model cars to classics to...
Addison Brown is the general manager of Casio Motors, a family-owned boutique car dealership whose business is now in limbo.
I'm a victim, and however, nobody's treating me like a victim. I feel like a criminal.
The trouble started late last year.
Over the course of about 60 days, we bought 4 Ford F-150s from individuals with clear title, valid driver's licenses, clean Carfax reports, everything checked out.
2 days before Christmas, Phoenix police showed up with a search warrant.
And all of a sudden, there's, badges and guns running through the front door looking for stolen Ford F-150s.
What went through your mind when that happened?
They got the wrong spot.
You thought they'd had a mistake?
No, absolutely not. Not here, not me. I paid for these cars. I've got good title. I've done all my checks.
According to police reports and law enforcement internal investigations we obtained, dozens of brand new trucks and Broncos were stolen from a holding lot outside a Ford factory in Michigan last year. Ford did not report them stolen for weeks. A few of those vehicles were recovered in Michigan, like the one police were chasing in this video. But more than a dozen ended up in Phoenix. Thieves attached blank, stolen titles from Georgia to those vehicles, re-registered them here in Arizona, getting new, clean titles, then sold them to unsuspecting buyers, individuals and dealers like AutoNation and Addison Brown's Casio Motors. How much did they cost you?
About $65,000 a car.
That's a big investment.
Yes.
It sounds like this should have been stopped before the cars even got to you.
100%.
This is certainly a unique situation.
Bill Lamoureux is a spokesperson for the Arizona Department of Transportation's Motor Vehicle Division. How did these vehicles get retitled with clean titles here in Arizona?
So unfortunately, the vehicles were not noticed missing or stolen in Michigan until they actually were titled here in Arizona.
He says the problem is Ford waited so long to report the vehicles stolen.
If they were reported stolen prior to that, the system would not have allowed those to be titled here.
So far, Valley police agencies have confiscated 24 F-150s, Dodge, Chevys, and at least 1 Ford Bronco. At this point, they have not made any arrests, and they've not identified anybody they believe is behind the scheme. But this lawsuit, filed by one of the title companies involved in the case, identifies the ringleader as a man named Donald Eugene Reed III. He is a 30-year-old ex-con, convicted of forgery, fraud schemes, identity theft, and most recently, filing 104 fraudulent tax returns and receiving more than $400,000 from the IRS in fraudulent refunds. We show up at one of the houses associated with Donald Reed in South Phoenix. I think we'll go bang on the door. Walking toward the house, I spot a $200,000 McLaren sports car in the garage it's also associated with Reed.
I'm looking for Don Reed. Donald Reed, is that you?
This man tells us lots of people he knows were ripped off in the Ford theft ring.
It was some guy up in Detroit. Some Detroit cats came down here with all that shit. They said that the vehicles was good, they was legit. People called in. Everybody said the trucks was legit. It's a whole bunch of people mad at them Detroit cats right now behind that shit. And one of them got killed in Detroit. And I think behind it.
Moments after that conversation, Donald Reed calls me on the phone.
Who did you guys get the cars from? Did you know these people, or how did they contact you?
He says he met someone in a restaurant who told him about a great deal on some Ford trucks. He says he thought the deals were legitimate. And then he repeats something the man in the front of the house said.
The person who sold you the vehicles got killed.
Reed would not agree to go on camera. Meantime, the people who paid for the vehicles here in Phoenix are in a holding pattern. Police have the trucks, and the victims are out tens of thousands of dollars.
It's not just the $300,000, it's all the other damage. Because we have sold stolen cars, we are considered uninsurable.
Casio filed a notice of claim against the Department of Transportation stating ADOT was grossly negligent in preventing fraudulent activities with respect to the transfer of the vehicle titles. And Addison Brown says Phoenix police are treating her like a criminal instead of a victim.
We have been threatened to be arrested. It's very disheartening. There's days I wake up and I'm going, what am I doing? How do I fight this? I don't know who to go to.
Turning
up
our
the volume.
Mic checks. I know. I'm so enthralled by this story. It's really interesting and very twisty.
Yeah, and we just also want to make sure that we point out that Donald Reed has denied any illegal involvement in this, and he has not been charged in this. He says police haven't even spoken to him. We found his alleged connection through a lawsuit from a title company that's suing people because they were sort of duped. So a lot of the parties that were involved in this are now suing each other. Authorities have not made any criminal arrests here in Arizona, at least.
There are a lot of stakeholders in this, which it's interesting because you mentioned how the GM said she's just out those $300,000. What about the individuals who purchased those trucks? They think everything's on the up and up, and then it gets confiscated in a criminal investigation. Now what?
Yeah, so in a lot of states, there's this law and rule that it's the bona fide purchaser for value law and rule. So if you buy something that was stolen and you did it in good faith, generally you will get to keep the item, and then downstream or upstream from there they
Seems
fight
like
over.
It would fit for these people.
Yeah, Arizona doesn't have that law. So all of these vehicles have been confiscated. Now, whether the end buyer was reimbursed for the price, we don't know at this point. A lot of people are sort of battling over who gets to pay, who has to pay for it.
Yeah, and you think tens of thousands of dollars if these trucks are averaging 65 grand, upwards of that when you're thinking retail costs. Who ultimately pays for that? So I'm a customer and I'm financing that vehicle out of pocket. Am I then on the hook for that, or is the dealership, or is my insurance now involved? How do you suss that out?
The courts will decide, and sometimes there's something in a contract, a purchaser contract that decides the title company may have some problems, may have some liability in this, so they're trying to figure this out. What we do know is that Casio Motors is on the hook for about $300,000. They paid $65,000 per vehicle. I think they sold them probably for around $85,000 each.
Crazy. And I know you reached out to Ford. No response yet.
Nothing back from Ford. A couple of other journalism outlets have done versions of this story, and I don't think Ford has responded to anybody.
It's interesting because I think as customers, if there's 24 vehicles that wound up in Arizona and those people legitimately paid and financed for them, wouldn't you think, okay, I've got a legitimate buyer who wants this truck. They've owned it for X amount of days, weeks, months, whatever. Let's go ahead and sign out the paperwork as Ford to get it to these people. What gives?
So yeah, this is sort of a unique situation because this was happening at the tail end of the pandemic, and vehicles were being sold for a lot more money than MSRP, like here in Phoenix, but they were able to be bought for less money in other parts of the country. So what we're told is it wasn't so unusual for somebody to pick up like a F-150, a very coveted vehicle, popular vehicle, pick one up in another part of the country, maybe Michigan, bring it here, and then sell it to a reseller, you know, very low mileage used car, and then that middleman can make a little money. So that wasn't like a red flag.
Okay, and so I think the other thing too is like when you're talking about no arrests, we saw your story started off with the police pursuit of the stolen vehicle. So there have been a couple arrests on that side, right?
In Michigan, there have been some arrests. This is a big story there. But we also found out there's a lot more vehicles that have been stolen off of the lots in Michigan. It doesn't appear that this is sort of a new thing and gone completely under the radar, except with police in Michigan when they have found out. You know, we had that aerial vehicle of them chasing that vehicle. But those arrests appear to be sort of maybe not the kingpin, maybe not the mastermind of this, but just people who had the vehicles.
And when I think about like how deep of an inside job, it's multi-layered, because you're thinking somebody at the dealership, or at that factory, I should say, had to have some kind of inside thing that they didn't notice. Dozens of vehicles are missing for weeks, not until they were titled in Arizona. Was it the VIN number that set it off, that flagged it?
Well, I'm not sure exactly how Ford noticed, but it was that Ford noticed that the vehicles were gone. Then they reported those VIN numbers missing. And then I believe from the paperwork that we've seen, there was a police officer in Chandler that pulled somebody over and was checking the registration and said, wait a second, this VIN number came up as stolen. And the person who's driving the vehicle said, no, I just bought it. I have a clean title.
Oh my gosh.
And that's how it sort of got going here. And that's how they figured out that there were multiple of these vehicles here in Arizona.
So you think about this dealership, GM, they did the due diligence, looking for the title, the clean title, even the clean Carfax. But explain the backstory on this Georgia connection, because that gets us down a little weird wormhole as well.
Yeah, so there were so many odd factors that went into this. One being able to steal vehicles from the factory lot without the company knowing or noticing that they were stolen. And then, so you have a stolen vehicle. These are untitled vehicles. So if you got pulled over and you don't have a title, that's a huge red flag. Well, in 2007, there were 12,000 blank Georgia titles that were stolen. And so what's that? That's 16 years ago. And they have been popping up around the country. And every one of these vehicles had one of those blank Georgia titles. So whoever stole the vehicle or brought it to Arizona attached one of those titles, filled it out, and were able to go to either MVD here or a third-party MVD office and retitle the vehicles so that they had a clean title in Arizona. It's sort of like laundering the vehicle. So then they had a clean title. And you know, Addison Brown at Casio Motors is considered sort of a fraud expert, an expert on making sure that car titles are clean, making sure that she's ahead of the game with vehicle fraud, because that is a huge sort of bad business out there. Dealerships and experts all over the country come to her, and she said if she was duped in this, and she did all the checks, that anybody could have been duped. There is a question, and we were talking about this earlier. I know the VIN numbers were not reported stolen at the time that they were retitled in Arizona. But back in 2007, those stolen Georgia blank titles were reported. That should have flagged these vehicles. And we don't know why it didn't. MVD says they're still looking into that part of this. However, in 99% of title fraud cases like this, it's the VIN number that will pop out. So is this a huge gaping hole in the safety net? Probably not, because of the unique circumstances.
For me, I'm just looking at this as a viewer, getting educated. You've been dealing with this for weeks, if not months now, but it's really fascinating because it's like, if they knew, if Arizona Department of Transportation, motor vehicle, and every motor vehicle across the country knows that you got 12,000 or so stolen titles that have been floating around for all this time. And that's the whole premise of this lawsuit that the title companies brought against our state, is to say you're negligent because we flagged you back in 2007 that there should have been maybe an extra layer of due diligence. If you're getting a title transfer from Georgia, hey, let's just cross-reference those numbers. Do they fall into this stolen bracket?
And they even look different back then than they are now. So there were a couple of missed red flags, but those stolen Georgia titles were entered into a national database. And when you retitle a vehicle here, they do a check on that database, and it's supposed to come up as a red flag. In this case, it either came up as a red flag and it was ignored, or the system didn't work.
There's even an anti-auto theft act that was passed in 92, modified in 96 to put on extra layers of caution when you're dealing with title transfers, because that's one of the most vulnerable areas when you're dealing with fraud and auto sales.
Yeah.
So you got some, you asked for questions last night, viewer questions, and we're getting some of those in. One viewer had to ask, I would assume other dealerships were sold trucks. Why were they not involved in the court case? You have a lot of victims in this.
Yeah, so AutoNation was another dealership that bought some of these. I'm not sure what that company is doing to try to get recourse for it. I know that Casio is involved in this because it's a very small family-owned dealership. So there's a title company that's suing them, and their countersuits and that kind of thing. They're sort of stuck in the middle because they're a small dealership. Some of the other ones that are bigger have much deeper pockets, and it might just be easier for them to swallow the loss.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because in addition to the hundreds of thousands of dollars that she's out now, it almost becomes a reputation, a blemish on her reputation. Not almost, it certainly does, because she's having a tough time even being insured now. So treated like a criminal, really.
It's not even just the insurance. If you're a used car dealer and you are found to have sold a stolen car, whether you knew it or not, in this case, there's no evidence that they knew those vehicles were stolen. They can't go to auto auctions to buy vehicles now, and they lost their line of credit. So it has really put that small business in a really bad spot. And Phoenix police hasn't come out and said, look, you are totally innocent. They don't even have something from a prosecutor saying, look, this company is innocent of any of this, because the wheels of justice in this case are moving so slowly. They're just stuck in limbo.
Yeah, because she was raided right before Christmas. It's been this long, and she's still waiting. If she gets a note from a prosecutor or from a law enforcement agency, will that be enough for those auction houses to let her back in? Probably not for the lenders, though.
Yeah, I don't know. There's so many really complex business and legal questions in this case. And it's such an unusual situation that we're not sure.
Yeah, it's almost like masterminds. You're like, if they could only put their thinking to good use legal purposes. We're getting another question. Many new truck owners may be afraid they were sold stolen trucks. How will police find them?
So police have recovered, I believe, what they think are most, if not all, of the vehicles that were brought to Arizona, at least the F-150s. Now, there was another batch of Ford Broncos that were stolen last year. One of those ended up here in Arizona. So there is a question of how can you tell if the title was stolen? What we know is that Ford now knows which vehicles were stolen last year. Those VIN numbers have all been submitted. So if you're buying a used F-150 right now, and you go to the MVD to do a title transfer, or you do an electronic title through the motor vehicle division, it should pop up if it's stolen or if it's not stolen. So these vehicles that we're talking about have been reported stolen. So you can buy a Ford F-150 and be reasonably certain that you're buying a clean vehicle. I was told from Bill Amaro from the MVD, and I didn't even know this, that if you're doing a person-to-person
Transaction.
Go to an MVD office and they'll do the search right there and change the title, and that really cuts down on any possibility of fraud. But I guess, the system isn't 100% perfect all the time, as we found out from these transactions from late last year.
Yeah, and Arizona is one of how many states dealing with these? Is it impossible to know at this point? I mean,
the only sort of little window that I have into this are from some police reports that we received from Michigan and some internal investigations here in Arizona from the Department of Transportation. And they indicate that these vehicles have ended up in New Mexico, Tennessee, and Arizona, also Michigan, and I think one or two of the surrounding states there.
So how can you make sure this won't happen if you're buying? Just go to MVD when you're doing a transaction?
Yeah, so there's an electronic title that we have here in Arizona now, so it allows the computers to make sure that the title is clean, or you can just go to an MVD office. I think you can make an appointment for a title transfer there and make sure that it's all done. I don't know that situation, that doing that would protect you from this situation in particular, but this is this little amount of that much title fraud that is out there. And going to an office using electronic title would certainly protect you from a vast majority of the schemes and title fraud examples.
Okay, another question here. There's a whole state agency spending millions to prevent theft. Do they ever stop crime rings?
Well, they appear to have stopped this one because once it got rolling, they tracked down the vehicles. Now, have they prosecuted the people who were involved here? The answer is no. They have appeared to have stopped this one. Look, when we see a vehicle, if you're a crook, a white-collar criminal, you are seeing dollar signs. Like that vehicle is just a symbol for dollar signs. Title fraud has got 100 different ways to commit that crime, and it's like law enforcement and the Department of Transportation are playing whack-a-mole because they stop this one and this one pops up, and they stop this one and that one pops up.
Yeah, the suspect named in that court case that you tracked down his name here in South Phoenix, this Donald Eugene Reed III, again, not facing any charges. At this point in the investigation, told you on the phone he thought it was a great deal from somebody he met at a restaurant and all that, but then alluded to someone, a murder happening because of these deals gone bad.
So we heard from Reed, the other person who we spoke to on the street, about someone being murdered, and then I also read something in a police report from Michigan about a murder, a death involved in this. So that's part of the story we haven't really fleshed out or tracked down right now. Who is this person who was murdered? Some of these vehicles in Michigan have been used as getaway cars in crimes, have been used to commit crimes. So I don't know if the death that they're talking about was involved in a sort of related or crime that came downstream, or what the exact information is about it.
And in your years working on criminal investigations, when you're dealing with like organized crime, sometimes those players have no idea who's further up the chain of command. So I saw in the story that's on our website, it's a whole list, and it even has tweets from Michigan PD, I think, from last year when the vehicles were reported first stolen from the Ford dealership in Michigan. It said that some of them were seen leaving. The drivers in these stolen rigs were wearing ski masks. So it was like, I mean, that doesn't sound very organized, we're just an extra shipment of semis hauling out these vehicles, wink, wink. But that sounds like kind of thugs they hired on the side to do this little side hustle.
You look at this, what had to have happened to get the car stolen from Michigan to this, clean title, adding these Georgia titles, getting clean titles here in Arizona. This is a complicated crime. These people really knew what they were doing, and who it is who figured out how to do this, we have no idea who that person is, and where any of the people downstream learned about this. The people who sold these vehicles here in Arizona, we were looking, and they don't really have any connections to Michigan. So we're not sure how people here figured out what was going on up there, because people who sold the vehicles to dealerships here were Arizona residents.
Right.
And I don't know if police have spoken to them. Donald Reed says that they have not spoken to him.
Interesting.
He's not named in any of the police reports. He's named in this lawsuit from the title company. So a lot of questions about how this happened and who was behind it that we do not have answers to.
Right, and his criminal record of identity theft, forgery, and fraud schemes and stuff like that. Sometimes you see people working in the same criminal circles, if you will, and then names get passed about, and who knows when opportunities become something that comes into fruition. But it is interesting, like, imagine the patience and forethought for some of these criminals up at the upper tier of this crime ring, because if they've been holding on to these stolen titles since 2007, that is a long game.
Yeah, I mean, and 12,000 paper titles stolen, and they're still out there, and they're still turning up in cases like this. It's like an Ocean's 11 kind of thing.
Yeah, so maybe this stopped the problem for now in Arizona. They'll just lie dormant for another several more years, and then we'll see this crop up again. But hopefully for now, Arizona DOT is flagged to that and maybe might put in. Did they give you any indication that they're going to put in further layers of precautions for titles coming in from Georgia or anything from Michigan?
They're saying that they are taking a look at this and seeing if there's anything that they need to change in the system. Once the VIN numbers were reported stolen, the system kicked in and it worked. And they're saying that that's 99.9999% of any fraud. They would catch it that way. So do they need to change the system because of this tiny little exception here? I don't know. That's their call, but they say they're looking at it.
What a wild story. Any final takeaways? You just really feel for this, like, for instance, that small business you profiled. Now they're potentially tied up in this drama and mess for years to come if we're waiting on justice to come through the courts.
Yeah, Casio Motors, I mean, it's a husband and wife. They own it. They've been in business for a while. They've established a reputation, never had any problems. She's considered an expert, and now they could go out of business because they're viewed as having sold stolen vehicles. And it's, again, no indication that they knew anything about it. They're victims in this, and they may lose their business because of it.
Really fascinating to see the backstory of all the investigations Morgan and his team work on behind the scenes. So thank you for taking the time to talk about it with us a little bit more. And if you got more questions, you can always reach out to Morgan through email or social media behind the scenes. For now, from the First Alert desk in our AZ Family Newsroom, we'll send it out.
Thanks for watching Arizona's Family. Watch us live wherever you are. Our mobile and streaming news app. You can also watch us on Roku, Apple TV, Fire TV, and Android TV. Subscribe on YouTube for live breaking news and video on demand.